All right. So in 1918, towards the end of his life, the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire wrote in a letter to Picasso, "What is there today that is newer, more modern, more denuded, and more laden with riches than Pascal?" We should thus perhaps ask ourselves what it was about this 17th century physicist, mathematician, inventor, moralist, and religious philosopher that elicited such soaring praise from a surrealist poet over 250 years after his death at the young age of 39. Although Pascal was without a doubt a scientist of formidable genius, it was not his scientific prowess which won him the greatest admiration among the creative minds of the early 20th century, nor which continues to feed his buoyant reputation at the beginning of the 21st. It was rather his profound insights into the workings of the human consciousness, his understanding in an age of humanism emerging from the Renaissance, that humans are un milieu, entre rien, et tout, a space between nothing and everything, capable of the highest highs and the lowest lows. He perceived that truth of human experience, which all great writers have and will continue to perceive, the same truth expressed by Shakespeare's character Hamlet when he said, "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" If Pascal lived in an age when human apprehension seemed to have reached its zenith, he did not lose sight of its inevitable nadir, which did indeed make its advent at the first half of the 20th century. It was the prophetic genius of this awareness which Apollinaire could not help but extol. Interestingly, it is Pascal's collection of various aphorisms and observations, which he had started to jot down as notes for a grand apology of the Christian faith, his Pensées, or his thoughts, which have garnered him the most attention to this day, despite the fact that at the time of his death, they remained in quite a jumbled state. Indeed, much scholarship on Pascal's Pensées since his death has revolved around trying to establish a coherent order to his thoughts. This has produced several different versions, the most prevalent being that established by Leon Brunswick in 1897, and that established by Louis Lafumat in 1962. While this adds an element of clutter to the systematic study of Pascal's oeuvre, it has the added bonus of more closely resembling the stream of consciousness technique than perhaps any other early modern work other than Montaigne's essay. As Marianne Cause writes in her biography of Pascal, part of the fascination in the differing readings is exactly this feeling of the separate orderings and layerings, as if we were indeed entitled to rereadings of Pascal's thoughts in whatever sequence might, at different moments of our life and reading, make most present sense to us. And here I'll just make a short note about the slides. So on each slide, there are a couple of pictures from Pascal's life, just some brief biographical information. And then at the bottom, I have some of his Pensées. The numberings are all taken from the Brunswick edition. As I mentioned, the numbering of the Pensées varies depending on the edition that you use. And the translation is my own, so I translated it from the French. The observations themselves stem from a period in Pascal's life when he was coming to grips with his new identity following an ecstatic religious experience in November 1654, as well as battling an acutely painful degenerative disease and facing social and political ostracism due to his sympathies for the Jansenist movement within Catholicism. The Jansenists, and Pascal along with them, had become the most vocal critics of the casuistic moralism, which had come to characterize much confessional practice among the Jesuits at the time. The Jesuits had the powerful Cardinal Richelieu on their side. Thus, it had not taken long for their opponents to be declared heretics and forced to sign documents disavowing their stance. This touched Pascal's beloved younger sister, Jacqueline, most profoundly. As a novitiate of the convent of Port-Royal, the center of the Jansenist teaching. Torn in her conscience as to whether or not to bow to the casuistic arguments of her superiors and sign, Jacqueline's health also rapidly deteriorated, and she died in October 1661, 1 month before the abbess of Port-Royal and all the other faithful therein signed the controversial document, and 10 months before her elder brother would follow her. In January 1655, Pascal himself had taken up residence in Les Granges, a collection of farm buildings set up on the top of the hill behind the convent of Port-Royal des Champs. Here he joined a group of noblemen known as the Solitaries, who were eager to practice an ascetic lifestyle. Although already in frail physical condition, Pascal here followed a self-imposed regimen of fasting and sleeplessness. It was also during this period that he began writing his most biting and satirical criticism of Jesuit casuism to date in the form of letters known as the Provincials, les Provinciales, under the pseudonym Louis de Montalte. He would continue these intermittently until March of 1657, sometimes writing from Port-Royal, sometimes from another residence in hiding on the Rue des Poiriers in Paris, which was incidentally right across from the Jesuit college. This he did despite strong condemnation from both the Pope and Louis XIV. His main idea for the Pensées sprang from his intensive reading during this period of two authors, the Stoic Greek philosopher Epictetus and the essays of Montaigne. This he made known to his confessor, Father de Sacy, shortly after his arrival at Port-Royal. He imagined a grand conversation between the two thinkers and their diametrically opposed views of human nature. Thus, the definition of humans as a space between nothing and everything, equally capable of godlike apprehension and self-restraint, as well as the most blatant foolishness and the basest cruelty. His aim was, in a sense, to take his reader on a guided tour of their own consciousness, exploring metaphysical truths along the way, but making them more accessible and attractive than St. Thomas Aquinas or Descartes had done. Pascal did not wish to theorize. He wanted to study the concrete individual in light of the Christian scriptures. Pascal believed the reconciliation between the two paths of Epictetus and Montaigne could be found in the Bible, which he also avidly read following his so-called Night of Fire on November 23rd, 1654, in which he felt certain he had encountered the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let us embark on this journey with Pascal, stopping first in the realm of imagination, where anything is possible, anything from ridiculous self-deceit to divine rapture. From there, we will move on to the caverns of the human will, where we will explore the potency of our essence in the context of nature. And finally, we will stop in the fields of narcissism, where we will contemplate the mediary role of the heart in helping us to see properly. When we finish, we will see where Pascal's journey took him and where it has taken us. In his commentary on the Pensées, Peter Kreeft points out that Pascal made quite clear in his notes that his book was to begin with death, an excellent beginning for his apologetic. It slaps us in the face with our own wretchedness, our utter helplessness before the loss of everything. Yet Pascal did not content himself with preaching the threat of fire and brimstone in the spirit of a medieval morality play, nor yet did he confine his terrifying description to the inevitability of physical death. For Pascal, there existed a hell much more menacing and a death much more final, namely the power of the imagination to blind us to that which is truly good. According to Pascal's definition of the imagination, it is that dominant part in humans, the master of error and falsity, and all the more so since it is not always deceitful. For it would be an infallible measure of truth if it were an infallible measure of falsehood. However, since it is more often false, It gives no reliable measure of its quality, affording the same evaluation of truth and falsity. The imagination, therefore, is in the Pascalian scheme of things rather a faculty of conscience than a neutral faculty of conception. As William D. Wood writes in his article Axiology, Self-Deception, and Moral Wrongdoing in Blaise Pascal's Pensées, according to Pascal, the central threat to the moral life is neither ignorance of the moral law nor moral weakness. Rather, the central threat to the moral life is self-deception. Nothing could be more frightening than this inability to perceive and respond appropriately to the true value of moral goods. The human imagination, with its tendency to be motivated by its own self-serving fantasies, can all too easily dream up reasons to justify the fulfillment of these same fantasies. In his contemplation of this meandering state of the human imagination, Pascal confesses that it leaves him with the terrifying impression of one who has been transported in his sleep to a remote desert island, where he awakes not knowing where he is and without any way of escape. Here we recognize an imagination akin to that of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, an imagination which induces such a degree of self-deception that in the end it leads to horror and alienation from society and from the self. In its ability to substitute a false, self-serving idea of the good for the supreme absolute good, human consciousness carries the potential to exacerbate the breach between reality and bliss. Pascal writes that humans want to be happy, only want to be happy, and cannot help wanting to be happy. But how shall they go about it? The best thing would be to make themselves immortal. But as they cannot do that, they have decided to stop themselves thinking about it. In his perception that the imagination can temporarily satisfy the human desire for power, knowledge, and pleasure, Pascal understood what lies at the root of our failure to live up to our ethical intuitions. While he praises the nobility of human thought, most notably in his passage about human beings being thinking reeds, he also reminds his readers of the fallibility of thought. Human thought or imagination, at the same moment that it leads us to recognize our superiority over inanimate objects, also leads us to recognize our limitations. We can respond to this latter recognition in one of three ways: humility leading to faith, despair leading to alienation, or indifference and diversion, ultimately also leading to alienation. Pascal writes that our intelligence holds the same place in the order of the intelligible as our body does in the expanse of nature. Our imagination is pregnant with possibility, a world unto itself, and yet at the same time devoid of meaningful content. Our bodies are wonderfully complex, and yet at the same time, mere specks of dust in the universe. Our imagination can either lead us to indulge in any means presenting itself to us for the expedient attainment of power, knowledge, or pleasure, blinding us to their illusory nature, or it can lead us to the certitude, joy, and peace, which Pascal experienced on his night of fire, as he described it in his memorial. Pascal knew well the illusory nature of an imagination which whispered of the supreme good of knowledge. Having written a treatise on conics at the age of 16, designed and constructed the world's first calculator by the time he was 19, as well as formulating probability theory, he was without a doubt a genius of monumental proportions. Still, it was not in such breadth of knowledge that he found ultimate certitude, joy, and peace. In the months leading up to his awe-inspiring religious experience of November 1654, Pascal regularly visited his sister Jacqueline at the gates of Port-Royal and would pour out his heart to her, speaking of the deep longing he felt to attain a satisfaction which knowledge could not afford him. Although he had not been irreligious up to that point in his life, Jacqueline wrote in a letter to their elder sister Gilberte, he understands that although he entertained the same feelings about God as before, he also believed himself capable of accomplishing everything on his own. In this period, Pascal begins to realize that whether consciously or not, he has been pursuing a path of diversion from the recognition of his own limitations, driven in his passion for knowledge to attempt to postpone complete surrender to the God he professed to believe in. This is not to say that he desisted from all scientific and mathematical pursuits following his conversion experience, but he no longer imagined that they could give him something which they were ultimately incapable of providing. Indeed, he no longer needed it as his soul was completely at rest. If in Pascal's order of human consciousness, the imagination fills the role normally assigned to the heart, namely that of being the source of desire and sentiment, then the heart is, as William Wood phrases it, a cognitive faculty that unifies key operations of the will and the intellect. It is the heart that furnishes us with the knowledge of first principles that cannot be demonstrated. In this new conception of the heart, as well as in his description of nature as an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere, Pascal perspicaciously bridged the gap that had opened between reason and faith and science and the supernatural. This description, which Pascal applied to nature in his 70-second thought, had previously been used to describe God and to inspire awe in humankind. As knowledge of the natural world advanced, Pascal pointed to its unfathomable vastness as a cause for abject humility rather than reckless pride. As the dualism between reason and sentiment became ever more entrenched, thanks in large part to Descartes, whom Pascal disdained, Pascal pointed to the irrefutable interdependence between the will and the emotional faculty. It is insights such as these which ultimately drew the admiration of Guillaume Apollinaire and others. In his article, Le Funeste Pascal, The Disastrous Pascal, Antoine Compagnon wrote, Pascal incarnates the modern illness. This Blaise Pascal carried in himself the seed of the incurable sicknesses which distress us. Of course, Pascal was not the source of these sicknesses. He only diagnosed them well before others. In his thought 437, he wrote, we wish for the truth and we find only uncertitude in ourselves. We look for happiness and we find only misery and death. We are incapable of not desiring the truth and happiness, and yet are incapable of neither certitude nor of happiness. The heart is the location of this awareness of both our desire for truth and happiness and our inability to attain them, thus prompting us to make choices. Peter Kreeft groups Pascal together with the spiritual family of St. Paul, Augustine, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky, all of whom he describes as being prominent paradoxicalists. They are able to look at man with both eyes open, which is terrifying and wonderful. It is terrifying because this divided will, this awareness that we cannot stop ourselves from longing for truth and happiness, while at the same time knowing we cannot secure them by any human means, causes us to seem alien to ourselves. It is wonderful because if this longing for truth and happiness is so universal, then they must be real. There must be some way of finding them, of experiencing this fusion of truth, goodness, and beauty. William Wood writes of how Pascal portrays the will as being buffeted by an unceasing stream of desire, an endless series of plastic, unstable desires that, when satisfied, immediately produce further desires. In thought number 72, Pascal characterizes our natural state as being one of constant movement. We glide and run away in an endless attempt to escape, and yet this is the state most contrary to our inclination. We burn with the desire to find a firm place and a final constant base where we might erect a tower which rises to infinity, but our entire foundation cracks and the earth opens into a great abyss. Elsewhere, he even goes so far as to say that the source of all human evil stems from an inability to remain at rest in a room. Our fertile imagination constantly generates some probable scheme for achieving happiness or finding the truth, and the heart can either temper the speed of production or accelerate it. The tool which Pascal recommends for tempering the speed of production is contemplation of the unfathomable microcosm within, a world no less awe-inspiring than the far reaches of the universe. In one very famous passage in Thought 72, as Marianne Cause describes it, Pascal exults in an art of detail. He revels, and we along with him, in the genius of the small. Pascal declares that he wishes to paint not only the visible universe, but also the immensity of nature, which can be conceived in the minuscule atom, an infinity of universes, each of which has its own firmament, planets, earth, in the same proportion as the visible world. On this earth, animals, and finally even mites, in which we will find the source of the visible mites, and finding in those again the same thing without end and without rest, that one might lose oneself in these marvels, as stunning in their minutiae as others in their expanse. Whoever contemplates themselves in this way will be astounded. They will tremble at the sight of these marvels. They will be rather disposed to ponder them in silence than to study them with presumption. Such a prolonged contemplation of the mysterious and wonderful world, which remains invisible to the naked eye, serves as an emergency brake for the heart to deploy in its efforts to halt the imagination's production of self-serving fantasies. As the heart wields these complexities in the face of imagination's smoke screens, the smoke begins to dissipate, revealing the void beneath. Pascal is in no way disparaging scientific exploration of the natural world. Rather, as Kreeft writes, the essential point here is not the scientific speculation, but the human consequence, the abyss, the bottomless hole into which our thought falls when contemplating these wonders. The final end is again humility. Just as Pascal hoped to expose the futility and deception of human imagination, which attempts to generate schemes for happiness through the attainment of power, knowledge, and pleasure, he also hopes to disarm any notions that the heart may have about discerning truth unaided. The self-deception of the imagination is exposed in the face of the vastness of the cosmos, and the independence of the heart is brought into submission using the boundless detail of which it itself is made but cannot comprehend. Pascal concludes by asking, who can follow these astounding processes? The author of these marvels understands them. No one else can. As far as Pascal could see, the Jesuit casuists of his day were allowing the self-deceptions of the imagination to deform the heart. Where the will had power, namely in its ability to rebuff the illusions generated by the imagination, the casuists made no use of it. And where it was powerless, namely in its ability to transform the self-serving schemes of the imagination into lasting happiness, the casuists endeavored to prevail. In his article on Pascal's provincial letters, Joseph Bertrand describes the casuist reasoning in the following manner. God, who guides souls without showing them where they are going, permits the existence of evil here below. He has his reasons which must be believed as good. Thus, for every sin, there must be at least one sinner. It is therefore just in certain cases to absolve those who, in accepting this evil role, work for the accomplishment of the will of God, and in a mysterious way, thus also serve the common good. The Jesuits, for their part, accused Pascal and the other Jansenists of limiting God's grace, much in the same way that John Calvin had done with his doctrine of predestination. Yet this Pascal fervently denied, asserting instead that humans are neither angels nor beasts, and that the real danger lies in emphasizing one over the other. It is dangerous, writes Pascal in his Thought 418, to show humans how much they are like a beast without showing them their grandeur. It is also dangerous to show humans their grandeur without showing them their baseness. The way of the casuists denied to humanity both its true grandeur and its baseness. By inventing an idle theodicy to justify the heart's submission to imagination's self-deceptions, they demolished the heart's noble potential. By means of their trifling absolution, they threw yet another veil over imagination's masquerade. Pascal's strategy was straightforward and simple. If they boast, I will abase them. If they abase themselves, I will boast of them. While the Jesuit casuists claimed to have a broader view of God's grace, Pascal saw it as a narrowing of God's grace, a denial of the belief that this grace could overcome the divided will of the human heart. It was a denial that this grace could break through the impasse created by the human desire for happiness and truth and its inability to attain such. One of the 5 propositions of Jansen had stated that the grace accorded to all who ask for it is that of right conduct. That of right thought is supernatural. Pascal knew it was possible because he had experienced it for himself. By the time he began writing down his thoughts in preparation for his great Christian apologia, he had had an encounter of such magnitude that it brought him certitude, joy, and peace. In his biography, Blaise Pascal, Reasons of the Heart, Marvin O'Connell writes that what Pascal had experienced was a love and overwhelming affection that nevertheless brought with it also a species of knowledge, an effective knowledge that issues from a direct confrontation between persons. The knowledge that this love brought Pascal was an understanding of imagination's role, true role, not as a schemer of self-deceptions, but rather as a worshiper, and that of the heart's true role, not as the dupe of the imagination, but rather as a wise and faithful servant. Humans are full of needs. They love only those who can fulfill all of them, wrote Pascal in his thought number 36. Was this grace broad enough to bridge even the gap between narcissism and genuine affection for oneself, despite one's insufficiencies? Antoine Compagnon writes of how Bergson's reading of Pascal made a profound impression on him.
Ruth, sorry, can you please conclude? Thank you.
Okay, all right, I'll just read the conclusion. Okay. In his article concerning Pascal's controversial final conversation with his confessor, Father Berrier, Robert Leuenberger takes up the question of whether or not Pascal did indeed renounce Jansenism at the end of his life. Father Berrier had been called upon to give an account of Pascal's last words in order to determine whether or not he had died a faithful Catholic or a heretic, thus sealing the fate of his epitaph in the Church of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. Leuenberger notes how Berrier tactfully avoided giving any definitive answer as to Pascal's renunciation of Jansenism, emphasizing instead his profound piety and patience in suffering. Christ had become his true confessor, his true spiritual master, enabling Pascal to share in Christ's loneliness, not only in the world, but if needs be, in the midst of the community of saints as well. This identification with the loneliness of Christ was an experience vastly different from the alienation which Pascal had lived through in his years of pursuing knowledge in search of happiness. It was also different from the solitude he sought at Port-Royal when he desperately longed for an encounter with God. Nor was it the same as the isolation he felt within the Catholic community due to his and his sister's Jansenist convictions. It was a loneliness which propelled him to further scientific discoveries with his treatise on the mathematical puzzle of the cycloid in 1658, to civic action with the launch of the world's first public transportation system in Paris in early 1662, as well as to monumental acts of charity, inviting a homeless family to live with him in the spring of 1662. All of this was done while Pascal himself was rapidly succumbing to a debilitating degenerative disease. Okay, Pascal rested in one who inspired his imagination to worship and his heart to service through his self-sacrificial love by becoming a bridge between nothing and everything. Thank you so much for your attention and for your patience. Sorry that I went over time.
Thank you, Ruth. Terrific paper, really good. Yeah, now we are open for question, but I'd like to start with a general question for all the 3 speakers, try to link these papers. The idea seems that in Andrei's paper, we saw a journey, and also in Ruth's paper, a Pascal journey through writing. Maybe because Alexander Brody was using another genre of writing, which is the diary, we don't see this kind of journey. Maybe I'm wrong, and Kirsten can correct me later. And so I'm wondering if it's this difference also create the difference in result, because it seems that there was a sort of catharsis when a journey was involved, and not when the diary was involved with just these random recordings of events in which the authors was trying to make sense of the providence, and it was feeling lost, and so the grief was never overcome. So